Hello and welcome back to The Path, the podcast from Lifestyle RX. Joined this week, once again, as always, by Dr. Byrne. How are you doing this week?
I'm doing great. It's warm here this week.
Excellent. Yeah, here it's raining. I'm hoping you can't hear the rain from my window. It's quite loud, so we'll see how this goes. All right, so in this episode, we're going to do another episode full of just your questions. So we did this back in episode 3, I think was the last time. So there's been a lot of time for people to leave questions as we've been going along. So we've gathered a bunch of them up, and we're going to go through, and I'm going to ask all those questions, and we'll see if we can get answers for you. So as always, if you have a question you want us to answer on the show, then leave it in the post on the community or in the comments on YouTube, Spotify, wherever you're listening, and we look at all of those and we will answer them. So with that, let's jump right in. So our first question is, my CGM sends me an alarm when my blood sugar is too low. This morning, before eating, it was 3.9. Another time it was 3.4. Both times I ate and it improved. Is this dangerous? What is, I didn't have the CGM and I didn't know. Both times I didn't feel ill at all.
Okay. Yeah, so this one's a great question because it comes up all the time, especially when people are wearing CGMs for the first time. So the big question here that I would have for the patient is, are they on insulin or are they on a sulfonylurea drug like gliclazide or glyburide? And the reason I ask that is because those drugs, so insulin or the sulfonylureas, are the drugs that lower blood sugars and potentially can lower them into dangerous zones. So we call hypoglycemic episodes. And so if the patient's on those, then this is really significant because it usually means that we need to make some medication adjustments. If the patient's not on those, so they're on metformin or they're on semaglutide or they're on Jardiance or Invokana, they're on kind of a variety of the other diabetic drugs, then we're not very worried about those drugs causing low blood sugars. And so very unlikely that they're going to get a low blood sugar that is significant on those drugs. So it really then comes back to, here's something where they're feeling fine. 2 weeks ago, they wouldn't have known that this was happening, but they now know because of the CGM. So there's nothing actionable here, right? There's nothing that they need to do with this. And frankly, one of the things I'll tell people, if they're not on insulin or not on a sulfonylurea, just turn the alarm off on the freestyle labor. You don't need it. We're not worried about the lows. The other thing is a little perspective, and overwhelmingly, CGMs were designed with people on insulin in mind, right? Because low blood sugars are actually the most dangerous thing that can happen for somebody that's on insulin. So the sensors are very sensitive when the blood sugar starts to drop down low. And most people, when they actually check to see, meter says it's 3.9. If they actually check on their glucometer, they're often in the 4s. They're in the healthy, zone. It just doesn't want to miss that, right? The CGM is very, sensitive to anything that's appearing low, and I think it kind of overestimates some of these lows, which makes sense given the way what it was originally designed for. So bottom line, if you're not on insulin or sulfonylurea, you can really turn the alarms off. If you are on insulin or sulfonylurea and you're seeing these sugars, then we definitely need to make some adjustments. So that would be something to work with your physician to come up with a plan to adjust them. Most of the time we anticipate that. So when we have a consultation, we'll talk to patients that are on insulin or sulfonylurea. And in fact, kind of throughout our system, we tag patients that are on insulin and sulfonylurea. So every time that we're talking to you, whether it's in a group context or not, we kind of have that in mind, so that we can kind of interpret that, are these lows something that we need to take a little bit more seriously.
Awesome. Okay, we'll go on to the next question then. So this one says, in regards to fasting, I was reading an article the other day that talked about various fasting out there. One mentioned fasting between meals. So, for example, eating breakfast, then fasting in between having lunch, and then fasting between dinner. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there's so much out there on fasting, and some of what we're calling fasting, I'm not even sure we should be labeling it. I think some of it's just fairly kind of normal behavior,
Hmm.
um, and then there's things that are clearly different, right? 72-hour fasts, 5-day fasts. So when I think about fasting, really we're kind of talking when we're talking about fasting, it's that full fast overnight that we're talking about. And so from the last thing you eat at night to the first thing that you eat in the morning. And for everybody, regardless of whether you have diabetes or not, you should probably be aiming at least around 12 hours. And that is because your body has a certain circadian rhythm to it. We were really designed, kind of our evolution has designed us that we eat and active during the daytime, we rest and digest at night. And in fact, kind of if you look at what's happening at a biochemical basis, um, we largely are designed to burn fat at nighttime and predominantly use glucose for fuel during the daytime. So if you're kind of eating all the time, then you're kind of always in that daytime mode. So you're always actually using glucose, and you're not actually accessing any of your stored fat, and so that can become a problem. And it is actually one of the problems that we see in type 2 diabetes is insulin resistance also makes it hard for you to burn fat. So both your behaviors plus the insulin resistance are combining so that you're not actually burning any of your stored fuel. So the 12-hour period, generally speaking, people will kind of flip into fat burning during that time, and so that's normally what we want to see. We use extending that fast. And so some people will call it intermittent fasting, but I think that technically the right way to think of it is time restricted eating. So it's basically saying, we're going to extend the fast to a 16-hour period and have an 8-hour window for eating. We'll extend up to that 16-hour point, really on the basis that if you're flipped over to fat burning, that's obviously what we want to do in terms of resolving insulin resistance. We need to burn the fat in the liver away, so we need to access some of your stored energy overall, and we need to do that by having you flip into fat burning. So if you're already in fat burning, let's keep you there for a few more hours, as long as you're not getting any side effects and you're not getting hungry and you feel good doing that. And that can be really a useful tool to help people actually start to access that fat and get rid of it. We don't like going beyond the 16 hours in the program, because when you think about why we eat, we essentially eat for three reasons, right? So we eat for energy. So that part's okay. We've got stored energy, so we don't necessarily need to do that all the time. But we also eat for growth and repair. And the big thing here is there's micronutrients, but most importantly, or maybe more importantly, there's protein. And we store when we eat, you'll hear me say this over and over again, we store fat, we store carbs, we just don't store the protein. And so if you don't get enough protein in a 24-hour period to satisfy your protein needs for growth and repair, you will actually start to break down muscle in order to provide the amino acids for those proteins. And so you can't run a deficit. If you run a deficit of 24 hours, you're by definition going to start breaking down muscle. What we find is going past 16 hours, it becomes hard to fit in, enough time to get enough protein. And so that's kind of how we approach the fasting. So between meals, I don't really think of it as fasting per se. You're still actually during the daytime, you're still in that kind of daytime physiology. And by and large, what we're hoping is that if you eat a proper, kind of what we talk, a properly constructed meal with enough protein and enough fiber, you should be satiated for several hours after that. And by and large, you shouldn't really need to eat between meals. If you are eating between meals, it's probably less an energy function than it actually might be a protein function. If you didn't eat enough protein at the previous meal, you may still have residual hunger. And that's kind of a thing that our dietitians will work with people on.
Awesome. Perfect. Okay, and then another question relating to fasting. So, if we're able to fast for 16 hours, do you still eat 3 meals during the remaining 8 hours?
Yeah, so this kind of builds on what we were talking about before, which is so you got up to 16 hours. You kind of bought into that we don't want to do it beyond that because we really want to make sure we get enough protein in. The 3 meals comes down to, well, how am I going to get my protein? And so if we look at it and we give people some calculations they can do. 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram is how much protein you need per day. Usually we have people start kind of, figure out where they are and start to work up to the 1.2. The trick with this ends up being, there's one other piece of the puzzle or piece of the equation, which is our bodies will only absorb protein if we kind of hit a certain threshold of amino acids in our blood. So practically speaking, it means you need to kind of eat enough protein in a meal to kind of send a signal that, hey, there's lots of amino acids here, and then the muscles will pick that up. That usually for most people somewhere around 25 or 30 grams in a meal. The other thing that happens though is beyond 50 grams of protein in a meal, we tend not to actually use that protein. We tend to shuttle it off for kind of into energy. So we either turn that protein into glucose or we turn it into fat, but we don't actually use the protein portion. So the nitrogen portion of it gets broken off and excreted. So it kind of gives us this little window that, we got to eat our protein in kind of, somewhere between 30 and 50 grams at a time. So if you kind of do the math of this, for most people, you're going to have at least 3 different times during the day that you're eating protein. Now, whether it's a full meal or whether you're having like a kind of a healthy protein shake, that's kind of one way that people will do it. But often it ends up being 2 meals plus a high protein snack, or 2 meals plus a protein shake, or 3 meals to get at the protein amount. And so each person's a little bit different in terms of kind of what they like to do, kind of how it fits in to their lives and what's convenient. But that's kind of the trick. So there's no magic about the 3 meals per se. It's just really, can you do you need to have 3 different times for protein? And for most people, I think it's going to be yes. Maybe if you're somebody that's smaller and lighter, you could get away with 2 with 2 meals, but probably pretty unusual.
Okay, makes sense. Okay, and then continuing on the fasting topic here, what's your thoughts about the odd day of skipping a fast?
Yeah, so this is a great question as well. So one of the things that is so important here is that we don't get really rigid about anything, right? So we've kind of got principles, but we don't need to, don't need to kind of get so rigid that every single day looks the same. And the reason why I don't like people being rigid is that rigid things tend to break. And so when we get so rigid about it, what happens is life takes over and suddenly we can't do all these things that we've set out to do. And then we just stop everything. And we completely kind of fall off track. So reality is there are going to be days that it just doesn't work. Right. And so it can happen kind of on two, what ends up happening is for a lot of people is they've got a day and they're going to be traveling or something like that. And it's like, well, they can either do a 12-hour fast or they're going to end up doing a 20-hour fast because there's just not a window for 8 hours to eat. What we're much rather have them do is break the fast at 12 hours and have a good meal and then not worry about the fasting for that period, that day. And then practically speaking, that, may be infrequent for people, or it may be something that kind of routinely happens to them. We're not that worried. If most of the days you're doing it, you're going to get the benefit of it. If the days that you're not doing it, you can still do 12 hours, you're going to get the benefit of that. And usually 12 hours is pretty reasonable to do because there's usually kind of a, 8-hour sleeping window and a few hours around the edges that you probably can do that. And then, bottom line is, no one day is that important. So, if you have a day where things are crazy and you have to kind of break your rhythm completely, just do the best you can, right? And that's where we're always talking about the better mindset. We're not trying to be perfect here. We're just trying to be better. And sometimes better is just in context of the day. So if the day is completely crazy and you've kind of lost control of everything, then do the best you can in that circumstance, and then feel good that you did the best that you could, and then move on. The more days that you can kind of be in your rhythm and routine, the better. If you're finding that you're really not getting into the rhythm and routine, it may be time to kind of sit down and look at kind of look at how you're structuring things and just see if can you create a bit more space in your life to get a better rhythm and routine.
Okay, awesome. Okay, and then moving on from fasting now to some other topics. Is there any correlation between the changes that we make in with eating and exercise and stuff in this course and reduction of heartburn?
Yeah, so this is one of the symptoms that goes away fairly quickly, and the reasons for the heartburn, not I don't think they're 100% clear, right? So, but if we step back, heartburn, very, very common symptom for people that are overweight, for people that have insulin resistance, for people that have type 2 diabetes. So it is a really common symptom, and a lot of people end up on medications for this. And so things like Losec was kind of one of the first big blockbuster drugs in this. These proton pump inhibitors, they basically block acid in the stomach. So what we see in this program is, as you improve, it's not even the weight, right? Because initially, most of the time when you see your family doctor, they'll say, oh, you're getting the heartburn. If you just lose some weight, you're probably going to get rid of the heartburn. We see it even sooner than that. We see it when people really make the change in terms of nutrition. And so moving from a whole, from a ultra processed food diet to a whole food diet, usually reduces heartburn for a lot of people. For some people, it does take a bit more weight loss. And for other people, we think it might even be an effect of what's happening to their gut microbiome. So, the microbiome are all the bacteria that live in our gut. And, there's 10 times as many cells of bacteria in our bodies than there are human cells. And so when we look at that, the type of bacteria, there are bacteria that can lead people to have more heartburn, and there are bacteria that can help resolve that. So longer term, we see that sort of change for people is that they get healthier gut bacteria. But honestly, I think the biggest factor is the food. And so get rid of the food, it's going to improve. As we lose weight, it's going to improve just from if there's less visceral fat, there's less pressure in the abdominal area. And then finally, the gut microbiome is going to improve. So it's always kind of a fun one, because I'll see people that are on these medications, and I'll kind of plant the seed that, by the end of the 12 weeks, you might not need that medication. And, you've seen people in the groups, everyone's pretty happy when they can deprescribe, stop medication.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Okay. I always feel hungry. Sorry. I always feel hungry even after a big meal, no matter what I eat or how much I eat. What can I do to get my ghrelin leptin functions to work properly?
So I really like that the person that asked this question is starting to think about ghrelin and leptin. And so, what we're getting at are the hunger and satiation hormones. And really, it's this important realization that hunger is driven by your brain, right? And so it gets signals from your body, which are these hormones, right? So that your body sends signals to the brain, but the brain, by and large, interprets those signals and either kind of has you be hungry or has you be satiated. And so, so what this person's recognizing is, hey, why am I hungry after a big meal kind of what wasn't written there is, when I've got extra energy on board. Even very lean people have a couple of weeks of energy on board, right? So we have this capacity to store energy. So we actually should rarely be very hungry. And so this breakdown around hunger really does come back to, well, how is that signaling working? And again, kind of one of the things that we see in this program that is really profound is as you make changes to your nutrition, we're trying to get you to eat in such a way that you get the right signals. And so the first kind of designation around this is whole food. And the reason why whole food is so important is, I mean, it just sounds like kind of a new age buzzword thing, but whole food really just means that it's food that comes in the cellular package that it grew in, right? So, it's not kind of broken apart, through some chemical factory process. It looks, at a cellular level, it looks the same as it did when it grew, on a plant or grew in an animal. And what's important with that is that's kind of what our bodies are used to eating, right? We're not really used to eating raw ingredients, right? So there's a bit of work that's involved in breaking down that whole food. And that work, believe it or not, starts even when you're cooking. When you're actually cooking and you're smelling the food that you're cooking, there are changes that are happening internally to prepare. And so you get a better satiation response if you cook the meal than if somebody served the meal to you, which is kind of interesting. Yeah. So if you cook the meal, you'll be satiated more quickly than if the meal just kind of comes to you in the restaurant. Your body's kind of preparing right from the outset to be able to estimate kind of what's coming in. And so when you eat, there are at least 11 different hormonal signals that go from your intestines back to your brain to try and tell you how much you ate, whether you get enough protein. And there's probably subtleties to those signals that give other information about the food that we're eating. And then your brain basically interprets that, and it interprets it on the basis of have we eaten enough energy? Did we get enough protein? And I always like to think that we're probably, in those two categories, we're probably fairly independent. Did we get enough energy? Did we get enough protein? If we don't get enough protein, we may overeat because we're chasing that, getting more protein, even though we ate enough energy. So you eat this meal and your body's got to integrate these signals. And one thing that happens is it takes time to get those signals. So again, kind of if you cook the meal, your brain's actually, just by smelling the food, you're actually preparing for that, and you're more likely to release the hormonal signals a little bit quicker. But it usually takes somewhere around 20 minutes to get that signal fully in. And so you think about it, many of us have eaten our meal, washed the dishes, and are sitting on the couch within 20 minutes. We eat way too quickly, right? And so that's one reason why you might not get the right satiation signal. But the biggest reason why you don't get the right satiation signal, again, in my opinion, is that notion of, not eating whole foods. So you're eating foods that are, essentially, a packaged food with a bunch of refined carbohydrates and some fat that gets absorbed super quickly. And it just doesn't send the satiation signal. So we call ultra processed foods stealth calories, right? So you eat 1,000 calories, but your brain maybe picks up that you ate 400 calories. And so there's this deficit that you're trying to integrate. And so you're still hungry. It doesn't satiate you. You don't get that right satiation response. And this is so incredibly important because we realize that much of weight gain is based on not getting the right signals from to the brain. And you look at the drug Ozempic or semaglutide, which is a blockbuster drug, and you can't open a newspaper today without seeing without seeing an article about this. And what it does is mimics one of those satiation hormones. So one of those kind of 11 hormones. There's GLP-1, and Ozempic basically is it's a kind of they call it GLP-1 agonist. It basically mimics that hormone in terms of the satiation signal, and it just blunts that satiation response.
Yeah.
So when we look at kind of that's the response to meals is very much driven by these satiation hormones that happen kind of immediately. On the other side of the equation, ghrelin is a hunger hormone, and so it's released by your stomach, and it's often kind of released in response or in anticipation. And so again, kind of understanding, we don't measure these things clinically. So you don't need to think about them so much from the standpoint of like measurements, but you actually can feel when things are working properly. Is you actually never get that hungry, right? That's actually when you get that overwhelming ghrelin signal, it's actually it's more a signal that your body's not using its energy properly, and the biggest way to change that is really through how you eat. Leptin's kind of an interesting one because leptin is actually a signal from your fat cells. So fat cells release leptin, and it's a signal about how much energy you have stored. And so there are people that don't make leptin, and there are people that have leptin receptors that don't work. In both cases, people become incredibly heavy, and they have an appetite that cannot be satiated. So when leptin was discovered, it was this big hope. And in fact, I think one drug company paid billions of dollars for the patent on it. And the hope was we can just give people leptin and that will control their appetite. What we didn't understand at that point was in people that are heavy, there's lots of leptin around. It's just their brain stopped responding to leptin.
Listening to it.
And one of the big reasons why the brain stops responding to leptin is insulin resistance. And so again, kind of back to this underlying process. So things that are, our body's designed for one way, but this world that we live in where it's, we've got food that we're eating that doesn't provide satiation response, that, has us overeat, that has us, fill our personal fat threshold, spill into insulin resistance. And then it gets compounded by the fact that insulin resistance actually blunts the signal that from the leptin. So our brain no longer picks up that, hey, we've got all this extra energy on board.
Yeah.
Long and short of all of this is, because this gets really, really complicated. We talk in the program all the time about if we can align our behaviors with our physiology, good things happen. And so when we look at this, there are ways to eat so that you get the right satiation signal. When you get the right satiation signal, you eat in proportion to what your energy and protein needs are. We take into account that protein, and we're very deliberate around the protein. And then finally, kind of on the nutrition side, fiber plays a big role here because fiber gets, when we consume fiber, we actually don't consume, it's not really that we consume it so much, it's that the gut bacteria consumes it. So that microbiome will take the fiber that we eat and it'll essentially eat and digest this. And then the bacteria in our gut create something called short chain fatty acids. And these short chain fatty acids are really quite amazing. First of all, they provide fuel for our intestines. Our intestine will actually use it for fuel. Secondly, they are signaling molecules that go into our bloodstream, and they signal a whole bunch of things, but they align our satiation hormones to work better and decrease our hunger hormones. And then they also work at the level of our fat cells. And so they help our fat cells. Essentially, we end up storing less fat when these things are present. So one of the things we're always saying is, fiber is kind of the unsung hero in nutrition. It has all these positive effects that happen. And the fiber effect takes a little bit, that particular fiber effect around the short chain fatty acids takes a little bit of time to kick in, right? So you essentially have to start eating more fiber. You start getting healthier gut bacteria, and they get healthier and healthier and can produce more and more short chain fatty acids. This happens over months. And so that becomes kind of another thing that can align, again, what you're doing with the underlying physiology of how it's supposed to work. And then by and large, what's amazing about it is it works. So this, back to the question, I always feel hungry after a big meal. What's going to be really interesting for this person is, probably 3 weeks into this program, they will actually go, I don't feel that level of hunger anymore.
Cool.
And I think one of the most impactful things that I hear people tell me is, what I thought was hunger wasn't hunger, right?
Mm,
It was craving. And now that I'm eating properly, I never get hungry like that. And in fact, when it's time to eat, yeah, I'm able to eat, but
yeah.
I'm not compelled to eat, and that's a huge change for a lot of people. It has to do with all these hormones. You don't need to know that much about them, but do know that the science behind kind of the program and what we're doing really does involve kind of all these behaviors that you will do to essentially get the right hormonal response to give your brain the right signal, to keep eating in balance.
Cool. Awesome. I think we have time for one more. So I'm going to go to this one here that is another CGM question. So it says the Libra monitor has a green zone between 3 and 10 millimoles per liter. They call it the zone in the app. My question is that there are wide variances in between 3 and 10, but still within this zone. Is that considered a spike, or is it only a spike if it goes beyond the zone?
Yeah. So you really will call anything that when your blood glucose goes up, we'll call it a spike. And what and it's you're going to see it really kind of from it's kind of a rapid increase that correlates with your meals, correlates with what you're eating. The 3 and 10 is the zone. So I think out of the box actually comes with 4 and 10, but it's really kind of a usual zone, right? And it's a usual zone for diabetics. So by definition, if you're going above that, above 10 across in a 2-hour period after a meal, then you're in that diabetic zone. But it's actually a really good zone to start with, right? So first of all, you're trying to get your 100% time in that zone, and then you can kind of tighten it up a little bit, because really what we'd probably prefer to see is anywhere between kind of 4 and 8, as being kind of where we'd like people to go. But it's all in context to what you're doing, right? So
Mm,
if you're eating a meal that is high in fast carbohydrates, then you're really putting a lot of pressure on your body's ability to cover that amount of fast carbohydrates with insulin, and that's the definition of diabetes, is that you actually can't do that. So when we talk about kind of in week 1 about getting rid of those fast carbohydrates, there's an immediate impact, which is, hey, blood sugars come down because the insulin you do have is able to actually cover that better. What we like to see over time is really a flattening of the curve, so that when people are have got kind of the nutritional principles and exercise principles around 4+2, what they'll tend to see is that their curves really flatten out. And so, instead of a rapid rise that looks like a spike, you get a bit more gradual rise, and it stays kind of, it doesn't generally go above 8 if we're doing everything right. That being said, the other big factor here, and you'll find it in the reports that we do, is in the initial report, we're going to give you a sense of how your pancreas is working and how much insulin resistance there is. For people whose pancreas is really not working very well, so their pancreas is what we call deficient, or deficient in terms of ability to produce insulin, those people will have probably higher spikes and that are harder to control, because they just don't make a lot of insulin. And so
yeah.
using the CGM to identify kind of what foods, so obviously those fast carbs, we call them red light. There are some carbs that are green light that we're not worried about, but there's a whole bunch of carbs in the middle of those yellow light carbs, and figuring out those yellow light carbs will be really essential to kind of blunt that spike as
Yeah.
we go. And for those people, what we'd probably be looking for is the range between 4 and 10 is probably just fine. It then becomes how quickly it comes down, and that's another thing that we can influence, right? So movement after eating can also influence that. So there are a bunch of good ways to get that down. But I think the actual range is it's a neat concept, and there's a bunch of work being done on that to suggest that time in range may actually be a better measure than hemoglobin A1C. So I think it'll take a long time to really figure that out. We've got a lot more data on hemoglobin A1C than time in range.
Definitely. Okay, I think that's all the time we have for today. So once again, thank you to everyone for sending in your questions. Keep them coming. We'll do another episode like this really soon. So any questions you have, you want us to answer here on the show, leave them in the description or the comments on the community or on any of the other places, and we will answer them. So if you're interested in joining the Lifestyle RX program, you can do that at lifestylерx.io, and it's currently covered by provincial benefits in Ontario, BC, and Alberta. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you, Brendan, for sharing all your knowledge with us once again, and we'll see you all next week. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dan.